Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit, podcast for educators by educators. And this is our second episode in our culturally responsive assessment series. So these episodes, they're based on a book edited by Carla Evans and Catherine Taylor called Culturally Responsive Assessment in Classrooms in Large-Scale Contexts, and you can see that in the show notes. And last episode, we kind of looked back. We kind of defined, what does this mean? What role does culture play in assessment and why it might be essential?
Right.
Or put another way, Mellisa, I want you to finish this simile for me.
Okay.
An assessment that doesn't consider student diversity is like?
It's like having a person without a soul.
Oh. Go on.
Only because it's like you have the shell.
Yeah.
And so when we don't take in the cultural relevance of either pedagogy or assessment, you have the shell, but you don't have the inners. And so you're kind of getting this sort of shallow.
Hollow.
That's the word. Hollow view of either assessment or pedagogy.
Yeah. I like that. Like, those chocolate ones where it's kind of hollow in the middle. And sometimes if you don't know that, you're expecting more there. And then it's just, that wasn't quite what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. What about you?
I went with like a toolbox, like a carpenter's toolbox, but that only has hammers in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so useful. And for some jobs, that is perfectly fine. And maybe there's a bunch of different types of hammers. But then for other jobs, it's not going to do the trick. And for some jobs, it's going to perhaps be counterproductive.
Right.
If you're trying to fine tune something, you're coming at it with a hammer, that's going to not work the way it was supposed to.
I know my dad, that was probably the least called for tool when he asked me to bring something. Most times it was bring a wrench.
Yes.
But
yeah.
Never the hammer, or very rarely the hammer.
Yeah. And that's what we're talking about this series, how we can put a little bit more soul into our assessments. Yep. How can we have a wider toolbox so that we can measure and do what we're supposed to be doing. And, so last episode was kind of looking at the what, whereas this episode is looking a little bit more the how.
Right.
And so what we're going to do is, in this text, Carla Evans and Catherine Taylor put together a nice instructional cycle guide that teachers can kind of work through and consider and view their practice through as they're going through.
Yep.
So it's 6 steps, and we're going to kind of walk through them. And it goes self-reflection, goal setting, instructional planning, teaching activities, assessment feedback, lesson evaluation, reflection, adjustment. And so those last 2 that we're going to spend the most time in, that assessment feedback and lesson evaluation, just mostly because that's kind of more the domain of our departments.
Yeah.
But we'll chat through all of them. So Mellisa, can you sum up the first 2, that self-reflection, goal setting?
Yeah. So when I think of the first one, self-reflection, and I'm sorry, I'm just that kind of learner. The Michael Jackson song, Man in the Mirror, came to mind.
Yeah.
Because the self-reflection to me is like looking inward. And what they recommend is that it's like a critical mirror check where teachers need to stop and examine for themselves what biases they might be bringing to either teaching and or learning process. And so one of the things that they talk about is, first, as a teacher, acknowledging your biases. Like we all have biases. And if you don't stop to kind of think or self-reflect on what those might be and acknowledge your own biases, you run the risk of overlooking or over-relying on an assessment or making interpretations about assessment results that are not really true.
Yeah.
The other action they kind of talked about is something that was really interesting to me. They said about it's important to understand student vulnerabilities. And they had a list, but the one that struck me was about when you're doing this self-reflection, sort of thinking about considering like how students perceive or interact with stressors in their environment. And the example that they gave was anxiety over tests.
Yeah.
Now, I suffer from test anxiety really, really badly. And so, I know what that feels like for a learner. And because I suffer from test anxiety, I try to think about what that might mean for my students and how do I need to prepare my assessments or my teaching with that in mind. But even if that wasn't one of my stressors, how important it is to still consider other stressors that students might be facing so that you can make sure that the experience, and again, what they are giving you or providing you in terms of what they know and understand is truly reflective of what they know and understand.
Yeah, I like that. And I hear kind of a note of grace throughout for each of those, grace for our students in terms of those vulnerabilities. And also, I think this provides, because it's self-reflection, because you're doing it by yourself ahead of time, to have grace for yourself. We don't have biases because we're bad people. We have biases because that's how our brains are wired. Yeah, our brains want shortcuts. They want so that it doesn't have to work quite as hard.
Right.
So we have to really consciously think about what are those shortcuts that our brains are doing, and how can we then address that in planning? Because it's all about on the front end to be proactive.
Yeah. So the second phase they talk about is goal setting, which, as teachers, this seems like, we always talk about, defining our destination, setting your learning targets. And so they talk about this move from the inward reflection to kind of setting a clear path for learning. They do highlight two things. They talk about learning goals and learning objectives, and they see those as two different things. And I think teachers would agree, whereas your learning goals are these broad, overarching visions, so kind of like your standards. But then your learning objectives, which I think in a lot of our contexts, we call those learning targets, are those clear and concise statements describing exactly what students need to know and be able to do. And one of the things that I thought when they talked about actions and how this might look like in terms of the classroom, they talked about two things. So one was evaluate your relevance and inclusivity. And I thought to myself, well, as a teacher, I should be asking myself, how can I make my learning goals and objectives connect with students' lives?
Yeah.
And so, for example, like if I was teaching a lesson about the ecosystem, instead of just doing ecosystems around rainforest and the Arctic, which in North Carolina we don't have, what would it look like to expand the context to local environments, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is a way, again, just pushing the envelope just a little bit more to kind of bring that in for students.
Yeah, I like that. And it makes me, there's a line here that I like that said, by including objectives that go beyond state or district standards, educators can address cultural competency, socio-political awareness, and injustices, ensuring a curriculum that is both inclusive and reflective of diverse perspectives and realities. And one of the things that strikes me is that we don't even necessarily have to go beyond the district and state standards.
Right.
To me, this speaks of just the value of the profile of a graduate, portrait of a graduate, which are part of our standards, both in district and also with North Carolina, something they've been talking about a lot. And I think those standards can help us to do so while still being in the domain of like, this is what we are hired to do.
Right. The other one they talked about, as you mentioned in your quote there, is how do we integrate cultural differences? And so again, I think if I'm a teacher, I should be asking myself, do my learning objectives allow space for students' cultural knowledge, values, and community practice to be seen as assets in the learning process?
Yeah.
And I really like that way that they talked about it, seeing culture as an asset. And so one of the things, for example, they gave, like let's say you're a language arts teacher and you're asking students to write a personal narrative. A way to extend that or to integrate cultural differences would be to ask your students to maybe write or orally share a personal or family story where they can draw on cultural traditions of storytelling, anything like that, that sort of brings in not just the standard of writing, but something that brings in their own culture.
Yeah, I love it. That asset being the key word there.
Yes.
That the differences in the classroom is not something that we have to account for in a negative way, add points, but it's something wonderful that they bring with them and that can enrich our instruction and environments and all that.
Yeah. So what about the next two stages, stages 3 and 4?
Yeah, so number 3 was instructional planning. So they say, this involves carefully crafting a roadmap for educational experiences that include differentiated instruction to address the diverse needs of the students.
Right.
So essentially just the stuff that you came up with for those first 2 stages, you embedding that into your lessons. You figuring out how to get that into your craft. There's a quote that I liked in here that I want to read. It says, is essential to align learning experiences with developmental needs, ensuring that instructions foster growth and learning appropriate to each life stage. In this vein, a perspective that must be thoughtfully integrated into culturally responsive teaching is that an individual's development is influenced by their immediate context and experiences. So a lot of what you were just kind of talking about, this idea that, how can we, that stuff that's in their cultural backpack, how can we give them space to bring that with and embed that in how they're kind of working through. And this reminded me that, why teachers can never be replaced with like AI and those kind of things. Like why can't just be, you just put them on the computer, because this is where you incorporate what you know about your students, what you know about your community. This is where that street data that we've talked about in prior episodes, you're figuring out how that fits into the lesson in a way that no computer ever could.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, and it talks about, that this emphasizes the importance of instruction that is not only relevant and responsive, but also empowering, preparing students to engage with and influence their environments effectively.
Yes. Which is kind of like what we're trying to do in terms of teaching, right? We're trying to produce this citizenry that is aware of their environment so that they can make actions to make it a better place, right?
Yeah, and the more you do that, the more you break down just the game of education, a game with like kind of unwritten rules that some people might know and some people might not. And you probably have an advantage if you come from my cultural background, because there might be little subtle things that you're picking up on.
Yeah.
But instead, if you're doing something because it makes your community a better place, your community, then that's authentic and more tangible and transparent in a way that I think benefits us on a number of different levels, one of which being what we're chatting about this series.
Right.
I think that kind of seamlessly goes into the fourth step, which is teaching activities. So there's the actual application, the time. So you've done all that stuff beforehand and students are showing up. So in this phase, instructional activities should be tailored to the unique classroom ecosystem. I love that word ecosystem they use in this.
Yes.
And be inclusive of and responsive to individual students' experiences, backgrounds, and needs, ensuring that the learning experiences are relevant and accessible to all. Yeah, this is the kind of culmination. All that stuff from those prior three steps, that's when you put into place. And this is kind of a reminder to me, just I guess like the iceberg kind of thing, just how much of a teaching takes place before that bell actually rings.
So like the below the surface kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. That you've done that self-reflection, that you've kind of looked at the goals, all the different goals thing about there. You've kind of built it into that lesson plan so that once the students walk through that door, what seems just kind of organic and it just happens to be taking place, there's a lot of prep work that went into it.
Right.
Some
Agreed.
of which being embedded in the curriculum, some of which just the teachers' knowledge of their students and their communities, they're layering on top of it.
And I think that's what gives us credence into asking students about themselves when we do those first couple of weeks where, getting to know you. You're getting to know them, not just, again, to know the shell of them, but to know the totality of them. So that, again, we're acknowledging that they're also learners and they're bringing knowledge into this space.
Yeah. I like that point of when I reflect back on my time in the classroom, I think I did a decent job of that in September. But this episode, it's airing towards the end of October.
Yeah.
Around that time, and I'm starting to see like the December break coming up, and I'm looking at the pacing guide, and I think I too quickly dropped that.
Yeah.
Thinking like I need to get to the real teaching, forgetting that is the
real
soul.
teaching. That's
the part that makes the real teaching.
Yeah. All right, so then let's look at the fifth stage, one of my favorites. So that one was called assessment feedback, which I like to see that as your check and your adjust, right? So you're putting things in, we're ready to do the assessment piece, and we're checking to see what students know. Teachers are collecting evidence of learning and then using that evidence to provide meaningful support to students and making sure that the measurement methods are fair to all cultural backgrounds. So in this stage, they kind of talked about, and we've talked about this before, two types of assessments.
Yep.
They talk about formative assessments, which we in the past have called assessments for learning. And then they also talk about summative assessments, which we also refer to assessments of learning. And for more on those two types, assessments of and for learning, you can check out an episode from one of our earlier seasons where we discuss these two types, and we'll put a link to that episode in our show notes. So when we're talking about formative assessments, just a quick review, we're talking about those small checks for understanding that are happening while the learning and teaching is happening, right? So it's the during, it's like my dipstick is the analogy I like to use.
Yep.
And some of the strategies that they say that teachers can use is like connecting the curriculum to life. So an example of this could be asking students to think about examples of where they see fractions being used at home during class, and then having them either share those examples or where they see it in the classroom, or even generating their own problems, right? So again, looking at their classroom life or their home life and asking them to reflect on that and making that connection between what they're learning and where they're living, right? So that's one way of doing that in terms of, again, being culturally responsive when we're doing formative assessments. Another strategy they talked about is sort of trying to minimize bias. And so, for example, allowing for multiple modes of expression when you're trying to assess something. Because I think sometimes, like an example that they talked about is, like instead of using always standard English, allowing students to just maybe use like a video or a picture to express what is it that they understand.
Yeah.
So that the standard English is not getting in the way, especially if they are struggling readers or the writing is getting in the way. So again, trying to minimize, making sure that there are multiple ways that they can demonstrate what they know so that you can truly understand, do they know this? Another strategy that they talked about is like giving affirming feedback. Now, really, really what is key to the formative assessment process is that feedback piece, which I know, like you, we start off really strong giving feedback, and then as we get into it, it's one of the things that we tend to drop. But what I liked that they highlighted is affirming feedback. So not just telling kids, no, that's incorrect, but maybe saying, oh, I saw where you had a really strong suggestion or a really strong connection. What you may want to do differently next time is, and you give them a suggestion. So, right, so giving in something positive, a strength that you recognize in the piece of work, and then offering as well an area where they can improve.
Yeah, I like that. It establishes very clear expectations, yard markers, or use that metaphor, the dipstick earlier. And I think what that helps also break down that guessing game of education, because it makes it very concrete and tangible to students what the goal is and how they're going to be measured and all that.
And the thing about formative assessment is you're trying to make those changes before habits become really hard to change. So you're trying to kind of get in there and make tweaks ahead of time before when you're doing your summative evaluation. And, you know, it's harder to kind of give that affirming feedback.
I often think about how something that you've kind of taught me, and you say a lot, is that formative assessment has both a noun and a verb.
Correct.
And yeah, there's the noun. There's the ones that's kind of built into the curriculum. I have proper nouns attached to it. But it's also a verb. It's something you're doing throughout. Like there's a quote in there that these assessment processes are not just periodic evaluations, but are embedded within the learning process. And I think that's how they can get that feedback throughout. That you're again, you cannot be replaced with a computer, because you're responding in real time while that learning is still taking place, so that you can make those changes.
And then finally, the last suggestion that they talked about in how you can be culturally responsive when doing formative assessments, they talk about support adaptive coping. And so having students reflect on like what went well and what's something new that they can do is also part of the process, because you are highlighting for students that learning can be hard and it could be a struggle, but that is not a reason to give up, right? We try to learn from our mistakes, like acknowledging that mistakes are okay. And that also is part of the formative assessment process, right? You kind of have to learn to fall down, but then to still get up.
Yeah, I like that. We sometimes hide those falls, and I think students get this. You can get a fixed mindset when you think that the successful students just get their summative assessment back and has the right number and everything was easy.
Right.
And we need to showcase some of those kind of missteps, both at the students, with grace and giving them opportunities to fix it, but also for us as the teachers, the educators, to show the ways in which we collected formative assessments that, oops, that lesson did not work. I'm sorry. Let's try this again.
Yep. I totally agree. So then when we look at the summative assessments, right, that final evaluation, there were kind of like two main things that they talked about. So one was emphasizing inclusivity and then providing, again, multiple modes of demonstration. And so an example that they talked about is finding ways to offer students choice. So having like, if, let's say they're having to do a narrative piece, giving them different ways of having to respond. So let's say somebody can write something, somebody can do a podcast. So giving them multiple ways of doing that and also giving them choice. Now, mind you, when you're thinking about multiple modes, I think it's imperative to point out, make sure that the mode of itself. So like if you're saying, okay, create a podcast episode.
Yeah.
Kind of reminded the student, like if you don't know anything about podcasts, that might not be the one for you, right? Because you don't want the method to then be what you're evaluating, right? You're still trying to, method is a way for them to demonstrate what they know, but the method shouldn't be getting in the way of what they know.
Yeah, that makes me think of some of our conversations around rubrics and making sure that if a rubric is about the standards, if it's about the learning targets, then it can be expressed in different modes.
Right.
But if the rubric is on, the process, the steps, which is helpful to give guidance, and that's where checklists can be helpful. But if that's how they're being evaluated, then it's harder to give choice.
Right. And then the final one that they talked about when it comes to summative assessments is pretty simple, connecting it to real world context.
Yeah.
So for example, you have a final project, giving the students agency to include contexts that are relative to them. So for example, let's say they, like it's a math project or something like that, having them collect data and analyze data about an issue that they care about is a simple way to kind of include real world context, and you're still evaluating, their math abilities. So those were like two kinds of things that they talked about in terms of formative and summative assessment. Yeah,
I like that. I think it was well summarized. It made me think of that universal designs for learning.
Yes.
Just that, and I suppose in the earlier steps, you have that different means of representation in terms of how you're planning your instruction and how you're teaching, but then the different means of expression as a way that's good on many levels, but also is going to help to make students' backgrounds an asset rather than a deficit.
Yeah. All right, what's the final stage?
So then at that point, you've done the planning, you've done the self-reflecting, you've done the teaching, you've done the assessing. So the last step is lesson evaluation, reflection, and adjustments. And this phase, they say, is where culturally responsive teaching and assessment practices are scrutinized, evaluated, and refined. And they stress here that it's a continuous cycle. And this is where it goes from 1 through 6 to that beautiful virtuous cycle that informs those next ones there. You can see how this leads into that self-reflection. It's an evaluation of how you taught and how effectively students were able to represent what they learned. That kind of nebulous idea of something inside their head, how effectively you're able to let them kind of express that in a way that you can provide that feedback for. And they say for this, the teachers should meticulously analyze assessment data, looking for clear patterns and differences among unique student groups, with a commitment to investigating potential underlying causes through having conversations with students about why they may have selected a particular option, written a particular response and item, or responded to an assigned prompt the way that they did. And this makes me think back to, last episode where we're saying, it's not just identify the gaps and then, say +4 for those to make up for what kind of mistake, but then you investigate where those gaps might have come from. Not from a deficit mindset where they're lacking, but from a, how was I unable to kind of capture that, And
that reminds me as a teacher, for me, the goal is always to kind of understand what they're understanding, right?
Yeah.
It's that if I can't see what's in their mind, so constantly trying to understand what are they taking away when I'm doing this lesson? And then can I get them closer to the target if they're not meeting the target, right? The learning target.
And I love that idea of like kind of going back to the instruction and curriculum, the reminder of that 3-legged stool that we talked about last time. You can't just make adjustments to one of the stools. If you do that and you make that leg like a wonderful, but you shaved off a 1/4 inch, that stool is not going to function properly.
We're going to still tumble over.
So you need to be thinking about how you're making adjustments to all those simultaneously because they are interrelated.
Yes.
We assess what we teach and we teach what we assess, and the curriculum is the means through that. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading this section was just that it is a cooperative process that is not done in isolation. So it's done with a PLC to kind of identify maybe some systemic barriers.
Yeah.
Because if I'm seeing a gap and then I sit down with you and you're seeing a similar gap, then we have to kind of reflect, okay, what's going on at a larger scale? So we can try to kind of approach that. But also, I love how they stress it's a cooperative process with the students. Education is not something that's done to them. It's something that they're a partner with, nothing for us without us kind of thing.
Yes.
And it made me think of that, you go from the satellite level, and we'll drop this in our show notes as well, to the map level, to that street.
Yeah.
Without that, you're going to have some questions you don't answer. This could be something big and systematic, but it can also just be an informal, casual, personal conversation. And they gave some simple prompts like, what aspect of today's lesson helped you understand the content better? Or is there something that could be changed in our classroom approach to assist you in learning this material more effectively?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and it's just a reminder that these are not numbers, they're not data points, they're human beings. So if you notice stuff in this phase, then chat with them about it, and then together you're going to be able to better uncover how to adjust that instruction and curriculum, or even how you're measuring it with the assessment.
Right.
So that's the 6 steps in this cycle to review. There's self-reflection, there's goal setting, instructional planning, teaching activities, assessment feedback, then lesson evaluation, reflection, adjustments.
Right.
Looking back, why is it useful to have this an overarching cycle like this when you're teaching?
So for me, I think this approach is helpful because, one, it can build a sense of belonging and motivation, and hopefully reduce feelings of invisibility that sometimes our structures and processes in schools can create.
Yeah.
I think this approach also, kind of like what you were talking about, validates our students as holders of knowledge, right? I think sometimes as a teacher, you can fall into this mindset that our students are these empty vessels, and my role as a teacher is to pour knowledge into them. But I think this approach helps us shift our mindset in that they're bringing knowledge and I am bringing that knowledge as well. And so how those sets of knowledge interact with each other in the ecosystem of our classroom is really what we're trying to unpack.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's value in a cycle like this, or really any protocol, because it helps us to intentionally do stuff that otherwise might have kind of gotten glossed over.
Yeah.
There's so much on teachers' plates, and we're always adding more, that it's a reminder of kind of taking a step back and reflecting from this distance might help you to catch some of the stuff that you would have missed otherwise. Yeah. Okay, so that's a cycle that we can kind of use when we're thinking about culturally responsive instruction and assessment. But where we're going to go from here is to try to think of like, okay, what does this practically look like in the classroom?
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up this series with that. We're going to look at some practical considerations that come from this book that we'll share with you all.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have any thoughts, you can email us at datalit@wcpss.net. You can also go to our website at www.wcpss.net/datalit for resources and to see some other episodes. I want to thank Millbrook High School's Traymond Ponton for the wonderful theme music. I want to thank you, Mellisa, for chatting with me about culturally responsive assessment today.
Thank you for a good episode as always.
And thank you to the listeners for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.